The courtroom fell dead silent as Judge Greg Mathis leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locked on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. What started as a routine legal discussion was about to become the most explosive moment in television history. Mathis had just asked what seemed like a simple question about criminal justice reform, but seasoned court watchers knew better. This wasn't just any question. It was a trap designed to expose whether the young Congresswoman really understood the complexities of the system she was trying to change. Crockett sat perfectly still, her bright yellow blazer a stark contrast against the dark wood paneling. The 43-year-old former public defender turned politician had faced tough questions before, but nothing quite like this. Judge Mathis, with over 2 decades of experience on the bench and a reputation for cutting through political nonsense, had cornered her with surgical precision. The cameras rolled, capturing every second as the tension built. Mathis smiled slightly, confident that his decades of courtroom experience had caught another politician off guard. But what happened next would shock everyone in that room and millions watching at home. The veteran judge thought he was about to expose a naive politician who talked tough on reform but couldn't handle the real complexities of justice. Instead, he was about to witness one of the most devastating takedowns in legal television history. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. You won't want to miss how this unfolds, and trust me, what Crockett does next will leave you speechless. To understand why this moment was so significant, you need to know who these two powerhouses really are and why their clash matters for every American. This wasn't just another political debate. It was a collision between 2 different philosophies of justice with real consequences for millions of people caught up in the criminal justice system. Judge Greg Mathis had built his reputation on being uncompromising, rising from the streets of Detroit to become one of the most respected judges in America. He had seen it all. His television show had been running for over 2 decades, and he prided himself on cutting through political rhetoric to expose the truth. At 64, Mathis had earned the right to challenge anyone, no matter their title or political party. He had watched drug dealers destroy communities, seen families torn apart by violence, and made thousands of decisions that sent people to prison or gave them second chances. Mathis believed that too many politicians talked about criminal justice reform without understanding how the system actually worked. He had watched countless elected officials make grand promises on television, only to propose policies that would create more problems than they solved. In his mind, most of these reform advocates had never sat across from a victim's family, never had to decide whether a young person deserved another chance or needed to be locked away to protect society. Today, he was determined to prove that point with Congresswoman Crockett. The judge had prepared carefully for this moment. He had reviewed Crockett's voting record, studied her reform proposals, and crafted what he believed was the perfect question to expose the gap between her idealistic rhetoric and the harsh realities of criminal justice. He was convinced that when faced with a real-world scenario involving life-and-death consequences, she would either retreat from her reform positions or reveal herself as dangerously naive about public safety. On the other side sat Jasmine Crockett, one of the youngest and most outspoken members of Congress. The Texas Democrat had made waves since arriving in Washington, pushing aggressive criminal justice reforms that had both inspired supporters and worried critics. Her proposals included eliminating mandatory minimum sentences, expanding drug courts, investing heavily in rehabilitation programs, and giving judges much more discretion in sentencing. Conservative critics had painted her as soft on crime, while progressive supporters saw her as a voice for overdue change. But Crockett wasn't just another politician making campaign promises. She had spent years as a public defender, representing people who couldn't afford high-priced lawyers. She had walked into courtrooms knowing her clients faced years in prison, had negotiated plea deals that meant the difference between freedom and incarceration, and had seen firsthand how the current system often failed both victims and defendants. Her law degree wasn't just a credential, it was earned through years of real courtroom battles. Her journey to Congress had been built on her legal experience. She had represented hundreds of clients, many of them young people caught up in drug cases who faced mandatory sentences that seemed wildly disproportionate to their crimes. She had watched promising young adults disappear into the prison system for years, only to emerge more hardened and less employable than when they went in. She had also seen how the threat of harsh sentences forced people to accept plea deals even when they might have been innocent. simply because the risk of going to trial was too great. This background had shaped her reform agenda. Unlike many politicians who approached criminal justice as an abstract policy issue, Crockett had lived in the system. She knew the difference between theories that sounded good in committee hearings and practices that actually worked in courtrooms. She understood that reform wasn't about being soft on crime, it was about being smart on crime, focusing resources on approaches that actually reduced recidivism and made communities safer. The stakes of this confrontation went far beyond the two people in that courtroom. Criminal justice reform affects millions of Americans, from families torn apart by harsh sentences to communities struggling with crime. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, with over 2 million people behind bars and millions more under some form of criminal justice supervision. The system costs taxpayers over $80 billion annually, yet recidivism rates remain stubbornly high, suggesting that simply locking people up isn't solving the underlying problems. If Crockett couldn't handle tough questions from Judge Mathis, how could voters trust her to handle the complex realities of reforming the entire system? The legal community was watching too. Judges across the country had grown frustrated with politicians who promised sweeping changes without understanding the day-to-day challenges of running a courtroom. Many felt that reform advocates had never grappled with the impossible choices judges face when trying to balance public safety, individual circumstances, and the need for accountability. The format seemed deceptively simple, just two legal professionals having a conversation about policy, but everyone in that room understood the subtext. This was about credibility, expertise, and whether reform advocates could handle the moral complexity of real-world justice decisions. Judge Mathis had chosen his battleground carefully, knowing he could use his decades of experience to test whether Crockett's ideas would actually work when lives hung in the balance. As the conversation began, both participants seemed relaxed and professional. Mathis asked general questions about Crockett's reform proposals, nodding along as she outlined her vision for a more rehabilitative approach to criminal justice. She spoke passionately about the need to address root causes of crime, invest in education and treatment programs, and give people genuine opportunities to turn their lives around. Her answers were articulate and well-informed, drawing on both policy research and her personal experience in the courtroom. But experienced court watchers could see what was building. Mathis was being patient, allowing Crockett to establish her positions before he struck. His questions were getting more specific, more pointed. He was leading somewhere, building up to something that would test not just her knowledge, but her judgment under pressure. The atmosphere in the studio was shifting subtly, the casual conversation taking on an edge of anticipation. Crockett sensed it too. Her posture became more alert, her answers more careful. She could see that Mathis was preparing something, but she had no idea what was coming. All she knew was that the real test hadn't started yet, and when it did, everything she had worked for in her political career might depend on how well she handled whatever challenge the veteran judge was about to present. The atmosphere in the studio shifted dramatically as Judge Mathis prepared to spring his trap. What had been a respectful discussion about policy was about to become something much more intense, a test that would determine whether Crockett was a serious reform advocate or just another politician with good intentions and dangerous naivety. "Congresswoman Crockett," Mathis began, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had made him famous. "You talk a lot about reforming our criminal justice system. You say judges are too harsh, that we need to completely rethink how we sentence people. But let me ask you something specific, something real that I actually dealt with on my bench." Crockett nodded, still comfortable but beginning to sense that something fundamental had changed about this conversation. The judge's tone was different now, more serious, more challenging. This wasn't going to be another general question about policy principles. "You've been pushing for mandatory minimums to be eliminated, right? You want judges to have complete discretion in sentencing, to consider individual circumstances rather than following rigid guidelines?" "That's correct, Your Honor," Crockett replied, using the formal address out of respect. "I believe judges should be able to consider the full picture of each case rather than being forced into one-size-fits-all sentences that don't account for individual circumstances." Mathis smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had just gotten their opponent exactly where they wanted them. the expression of a veteran courtroom strategist who had successfully set up his next move. "All right. Let's test that theory with real facts, not theoretical discussions," Mathis said, leaning forward with the intensity that had made him one of television's most compelling judges. "I'm going to give you a case. Not some textbook example, but something I actually dealt with on my bench. I want to see how your reforms would work when real lives are on the line." The courtroom audience shifted in their seats, sensing that something significant was about to happen. This was no longer a policy debate between equals. This was Judge Mathis using his experience and authority to challenge everything Crockett claimed to believe about criminal justice reform. "Here's the situation," Mathis continued, his voice growing more serious with each word. "A 19-year-old kid comes before my bench. Third offense, drug dealing. Not using drugs, dealing them. He's been caught selling near a school zone, which automatically doubles the penalty under current law. His public defender tells me he's dealing to support his sick mother and younger siblings after his father abandoned the family. The kid shows genuine remorse, promises to change his life, has letters of support from his pastor and some community members who believe in him." Crockett listened intently, her legal mind already processing the various factors that would influence sentencing in such a case. She could visualize the young defendant, probably reminded of many clients she had represented during her years as a public defender. "Now, under current mandatory minimums, I have to give him at least 5 years in state prison. No exceptions, no consideration of circumstances. 5 years minimum because it's his third offense and because of the school zone enhancement. Under your proposed reforms, I would have complete discretion. I could give him probation, community service, drug counseling, whatever I thought was appropriate. So tell me, Congresswoman, what would you do?" Crockett took a moment to consider the scenario, recognizing both its complexity and its obvious appeal to reformist thinking. This seemed like exactly the kind of case where rigid mandatory sentences failed to serve justice. "Your Honor, based on what you've told me, this sounds exactly like the kind of case where judicial discretion is essential. A young person caught up in difficult circumstances, showing genuine remorse, with family responsibilities and community support. I would lean heavily toward rehabilitation over incarceration, probation with intensive supervision, mandatory drug counseling, community service, job training, approaches that address the underlying issues rather than simply warehousing him in prison." "Interesting," Mathis replied, his tone suggesting this was exactly the answer he had expected and wanted. "So, you'd go with probation, counseling, maybe some community service?" "Yes, I believe that would better serve both the individual and the community in the long run. Prison would likely make him more criminal, not less." Mathis nodded slowly, then dropped his voice to a more serious register. The entire room seemed to lean forward as he prepared to deliver what everyone could sense would be the crucial blow. "Here's what you don't know, Congresswoman. What I didn't tell you initially about this case." The room went completely quiet. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath, sensing that whatever came next would be the climax of this entire confrontation. 3 months before this 19-year-old came before my bench," Mathis continued, his voice carrying the weight of years of difficult decisions, "another young dealer came through our court system. Similar background, similar sob story. Single mother, family struggling financially, community support, promises to change. Same age, same circumstances, same kind of arguments from his defense attorney about second chances and rehabilitation." Crockett remained silent, but her expression was beginning to change as she sensed where this was heading. "That earlier defendant got probation from a different judge in our district. The judge was compassionate, just like you're suggesting I should be. Gave him counseling, community service, the whole rehabilitation package. You know what happened to that kid during his 3rd month of probation?" The tension in the room was now almost unbearable. Every person present understood that Judge Mathis was about to deliver information that would fundamentally change the moral calculus of the decision. He sold fentanyl-laced heroin to a 16-year-old girl named Maria Santos. She was an honor student, planning to go to college, had never used hard drugs before. She thought she was buying regular heroin for the first time, maybe trying to fit in with some older kids. She died that same night in her bedroom while her parents slept in the next room. They found her body the next morning. The impact hit the courtroom like a physical force. Several audience members gasped audibly, and Crockett's face went pale as she processed the devastating complexity of what Mathis had just presented. Maria Santos had a 4.0 grade point average, Mathis continued relentlessly. She volunteered at a local animal shelter. She wanted to be a veterinarian. She had never been in trouble with the law, never even had a detention in high school. Her whole life ahead of her, destroyed because a judge like you decided that compassion was more important than community safety. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the courtroom was on Crockett now, watching to see how she would respond to this impossible moral challenge. Now, Mathis said, his voice carrying the full authority of his decades on the bench. Knowing that information, knowing that your decision could result in an innocent child's death just like Maria Santos, what's your sentence for the 19-year-old dealer standing before you? The question hung in the air like a sword over Crockett's head. Judge Mathis had taken her idealistic reform proposals and confronted them with the most brutal possible reality, the knowledge that mercy shown to one person might result in the death of another innocent person. This wasn't about policy papers or campaign speeches anymore. This was about real people, real consequences, real lives hanging in the balance. Crockett sat in stunned silence, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. The cameras captured her moment of apparent paralysis as she processed not just the legal question, but the impossible moral complexity Mathis had introduced. How do you balance compassion for a young person who made bad choices against the potential risk to completely innocent victims? I can see you're thinking hard about this, Congresswoman, Mathis said, his tone now carrying a note of what seemed like sympathy mixed with triumph. This is exactly the kind of decision that judges make every single day. We don't have the luxury of theoretical discussions or committee hearings or policy papers. We have to look at a young person's face, listen to their story, and then decide whether compassion or community safety takes priority. He leaned back in his chair, but his intensity never wavered. Your criminal justice reforms sound wonderful in speeches and interviews, but when you're sitting in this chair, when you know that being too lenient might cost an innocent person their life, do you still believe judges shouldn't have mandatory guidelines to help them make these impossible choices? The audience was completely silent now, even those who had come in strongly supporting Crockett's reform agenda. The abstract policy debate had become intensely personal and moral. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about the agonizing reality of a system where every decision carries enormous consequences for real people. Take your time, Congresswoman, Mathis said, his voice now carrying what sounded like genuine concern rather than hostility. But remember, that 19-year-old is standing in front of you right now, waiting for your decision. His family is in the courtroom, hoping you'll give him another chance. But somewhere out there might be another Maria Santos, another innocent kid who could die if you guess wrong about whether this defendant is really ready to change his life. The weight of the moment was crushing. Everything Crockett had advocated for in her political career seemed to crumble in the face of this impossible choice. How do you maintain principles of rehabilitation and second chances when those very principles might lead to innocent deaths? The silence in the courtroom stretched for what felt like an eternity. Judge Mathis sat back with the confident expression of someone who had just delivered a checkmate move, certain that his decades of experience had cornered the Congresswoman with an impossible moral choice. The audience held their breath, waiting to see if Crockett would crumble under the pressure, abandon her reform principles, or reveal herself as dangerously naive about the real consequences of criminal justice decisions. Then Jasmine Crockett did something that nobody in that room expected. Instead of looking defeated or scrambling desperately for an answer, she sat up straighter, took a deep breath, and looked Judge Mathis directly in the eyes with a clarity that suggested she had found something in his challenge that he hadn't intended to give her. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady and clear despite the enormous pressure. I want to start by saying that what happened to Maria Santos is absolutely tragic. My heart goes out to her family, and nothing I'm about to say should be interpreted as minimizing their loss or the seriousness of the situation you've described. Mathis raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting this kind of composed response. The audience leaned forward, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen, that Crockett was not going to simply fold under the weight of his challenge. But, Your Honor, I have to respectfully point out that while your scenario is emotionally powerful and morally complex, you've actually made a fundamental error in how you've framed this decision." Her voice was gaining strength now, the confidence that had made her an effective trial attorney beginning to emerge. "What kind of error?" Mathis asked, his tone suggesting he was still confident but now genuinely curious about where she was heading with this response. Crockett stood up, her yellow blazer catching the courtroom lights as she began to pace slightly, a habit from her days addressing juries when she needed to command attention and guide them through complex legal arguments. "You've presented this as a choice between compassion and public safety, between giving someone a second chance and protecting innocent people like Maria Santos. But that's a false choice, and frankly, it's exactly the kind of thinking that has created the problems in our current system." The courtroom was electric now, as people began to realize that Crockett was not retreating from her reform positions, but was actually using Mathis's challenge to build a stronger case for them. "Your Honor, you're asking me to sentence the 19-year-old defendant based not on his actions, his circumstances, his criminal history, or any assessment of his likelihood to reoffend. You're asking me to sentence him based on what a completely different person did after receiving a different sentence from a different judge in a different case. That's not justice. That's fear-based decision-making." Several audience members exchanged glances, recognizing that Crockett was not only refusing to be trapped by Mathis's question, but was actually turning it around on him in a way that challenged the entire premise of his argument. "In my years as a public defender," Crockett continued, her voice now filled with the passion and expertise that had made her an effective advocate, "I learned that every case is unique, every defendant is an individual, and every situation requires careful analysis of specific factors. The 19-year-old standing before you isn't responsible for what another dealer did 3 months earlier. He's responsible for his own actions, and he should be sentenced based on his own circumstances, his own history, and his own potential for rehabilitation or continued criminal behavior." Judge Mathis's confident expression was beginning to change. The trap he had set was not only failing to catch his target, but was being systematically dismantled in a way that made his own reasoning appear flawed. "But more importantly, Your Honor," Crockett said, her voice now carrying the full force of her legal training and courtroom experience, "your scenario actually proves exactly why we need comprehensive reform, not why we should maintain the current system." She turned to face Mathis directly, her expression serious but not hostile. "You mentioned that the other young dealer received probation and later caused Maria Santos's death. That's tragic, but where was the intensive supervision that should have been part of his probation? Where was the drug treatment that should have addressed his underlying addiction? Where were the job training programs that should have given him alternatives to dealing drugs? Where was the mental health counseling that might have helped him make better choices?" The room was completely focused on her now, as she systematically addressed each element of Mathis's challenge with the kind of detailed policy knowledge that demonstrated genuine expertise rather than political talking points. "Just putting someone on probation without comprehensive support isn't reform, it's neglect," she continued. "And just locking someone up for 5 years without addressing the underlying issues that led them to deal drugs isn't justice, it's warehousing. When that mandatory minimum sentence ends, defendants often come out more connected to criminal networks, less employable, more desperate, and more likely to commit serious crimes than when they went in." Crockett paused, allowing her arguments to sink in before delivering what would become the most quoted part of her response. "So let me ask you a question, Your Honor," she said, completely reversing the power dynamic of the conversation. "In your decades on the bench, how many people have you sentenced to mandatory minimums who later reoffended after serving their full sentences? How many Maria Santos cases could have been prevented if we had invested in real rehabilitation programs, comprehensive mental health treatment, job training, and intensive supervision instead of just warehousing people in overcrowded prisons?" The courtroom was stunned. What had started as Judge Mathis testing Crockett had become Crockett systematically challenging the entire foundation of how the criminal justice system operates, using his own example to build her case. "Here's what I would do with your 19-year-old dealer," Crockett said, her voice now completely confident and decisive. "I wouldn't just choose between probation and prison like those are the only 2 options. I'd sentence him to a comprehensive evidence-based program that includes intensive drug treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, job training, educational opportunities, and strict supervision with immediate consequences for any violations. She began counting off on her fingers, demonstrating the kind of detailed thinking that policy experts recognized as genuinely sophisticated. I'd require him to make financial restitution to his community through work programs. I'd mandate that he participate in victim impact programs so he understands the real consequences of drug dealing. I'd connect his family with social services to address the underlying economic issues that led him to deal drugs in the first place. And if he violated any part of that program, if he missed appointments, failed drug tests, or showed any signs of returning to criminal activity, then yes, he would face serious jail time. The audience was riveted now, seeing a level of policy detail and practical thinking that went far beyond typical political rhetoric. But here's the crucial difference, Crockett continued. We'd be investing in solutions that actually work, not just punishment that makes us feel like we're doing something. We'd be addressing the root causes that create drug dealers instead of just cycling them through prisons and back onto the streets. She looked directly at Mathis, her expression serious but respectful. Your Honor, you presented Maria Santos's death as an argument against reform, but I'd argue that her death is exactly why we need comprehensive, intelligent reform. The current system failed her just as much as it failed the dealer who killed her. We're so focused on the false choice between punishment and leniency that we forget about the most important goal of all, actually preventing crimes before they happen. Judge Mathis sat in stunned silence, clearly not having expected this level of systematic counter-argument. The confident trap he had set had been not just avoided, but turned into a platform for Crockett to demonstrate exactly the kind of deep, nuanced thinking about criminal justice that he had doubted she possessed. Your Honor, Crockett concluded, her voice softer now but no less powerful. I understand the impossible weight of the decisions you've had to make throughout your career. I've seen how our current system forces judges into these terrible choices between inadequate options. But that's exactly why we need to change it. We need to give judges better tools, not just mandatory guidelines that prevent them from considering individual circumstances. We need to invest in evidence-based programs that actually work to reduce recidivism and protect public safety, not just policies that feel tough, but don't make us any safer. She sat back down, her eyes never leaving Mathis's face. The question isn't whether we care about protecting people like Maria Santos. Of course we do. The question is whether we're smart enough and committed enough to pursue policies that actually make people safer, rather than just policies that allow us to feel like we're being tough on crime while the real problems get worse. Judge Mathis sat in complete silence for a long moment, his expression showing a mixture of surprise, respect, and what appeared to be genuine reconsideration of assumptions he had held for decades. The courtroom remained utterly quiet as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Not just a political figure surviving a hostile challenge, but someone using that challenge to demonstrate a level of expertise and sophisticated thinking that had transformed the entire conversation. Finally, Judge Mathis spoke, and his voice carried a tone of respect that hadn't been there at the beginning of their exchange. Congresswoman, I have to be honest with you. When I asked that question, I was expecting to expose what I thought were the weaknesses in your reform agenda. I thought I was going to show that your ideas sound good in theory, but fall apart when confronted with real-world consequences. He leaned forward, his demeanor completely different now. Instead, you've given me more to think about than I've had in years of these discussions. You didn't just defend your position. You made me question some of my own assumptions about how we approach these impossible decisions. The audience stirred, recognizing that something extraordinary had just occurred. A veteran judge with decades of experience, known for his ability to cut through political nonsense, had not only been challenged but had actually acknowledged that his challenger had fundamentally changed how he thought about the issue. What you said about comprehensive programs, about addressing root causes, about giving people real alternatives, that's not the kind of soft-on-crime rhetoric I usually hear from politicians. That's the kind of detailed, practical thinking we need more of in these discussions. Within minutes of the exchange ending, social media exploded with reactions. Legal professionals who had been watching, many of whom had expected to see another politician fumble when confronted with real-world complexity, instead found themselves sharing clips and expressing genuine surprise at the sophistication of Crockett's response. A former federal prosecutor posted on social media, "I went into this video thinking Judge Mathis would expose another politician who doesn't understand the complexities of criminal justice. Instead, I watched someone demonstrate exactly the kind of comprehensive, evidence-based thinking we desperately need in policymaking. This is what happens when you have someone who's actually worked in the system." A retired state judge commented, "Crockett didn't just avoid the trap Judge Mathis set. She used it to make a more compelling argument for intelligent reform than I've heard in 20 years of policy debates. This is the difference between ideology and expertise." Public defenders across the country began sharing the video, many noting that Crockett's response captured exactly the frustrations they experienced daily in a system that often forced them to choose between inadequate options for their clients. Finally, someone who understands that reform isn't about being soft on crime, it's about being smart on crime, wrote one veteran public defender. She articulated what those of us working in the system have been trying to say for years. The response from the broader legal community was swift and largely positive. Law school professors began incorporating the clip into their criminal justice courses as an example of how to address complex policy questions with nuanced, evidence-based thinking rather than simplistic talking points. One criminal law professor explained to her students, "This exchange demonstrates the difference between political rhetoric and policy expertise." Notice how Congresswoman Crockett didn't retreat from her principles when challenged, but instead used the challenge to demonstrate why her approach is actually more practical and effective than current policies. The political implications of the exchange were significant and immediate. Conservative legal scholars who had been skeptical of Crockett's reform proposals found themselves engaging seriously with her arguments rather than dismissing them as liberal ideology. A prominent conservative legal commentator wrote, "While I don't agree with all of Congresswoman Crockett's positions, her response to Judge Mathis demonstrated the kind of serious, detailed thinking about criminal justice that could actually lead to bipartisan solutions. This is how policy discussions should be conducted." Progressive activists, meanwhile, celebrated having a spokesperson who could articulate their positions with both passion and unassailable expertise. "This is why representation matters," one advocacy group posted. "Having someone who's actually been in the trenches, who's represented real people facing real consequences, makes all the difference in these debates." The clip began influencing actual policy discussions almost immediately. Lawmakers who had been hesitant to support comprehensive criminal justice reform started reaching out to Crockett's office for more detailed briefings on her proposals. Before watching this exchange, criminal justice reform felt like a vague concept that might sound good, but could have dangerous unintended consequences, explained one moderate Republican senator. But listening to Congresswoman Crockett break down exactly how evidence-based programs would work in practice with built-in accountability measures and immediate consequences for violations made it seem not just feasible, but actually more effective than our current approach. State governments began exploring pilot programs based on the comprehensive approach Crockett had outlined, with several announcing plans to test intensive supervision programs that combined treatment, job training, and strict accountability measures. Perhaps most significantly, the exchange appeared to change both participants in fundamental ways. Judge Mathis began incorporating discussions about systematic reform into his television program, using his platform to explore the complexities and nuances that Crockett had raised. In subsequent interviews, Mathis acknowledged that the exchange had forced him to reconsider some of his long-held beliefs. "I've always prided myself on cutting through political rhetoric to get to the truth," he explained. "But Congresswoman Crockett showed me that sometimes what sounds like rhetoric is actually sophisticated policy thinking that I hadn't taken the time to fully understand." For Crockett, the exchange provided a level of credibility and respect that extended far beyond her usual political base. Her ability to handle a hostile challenge with such expertise and grace made her a sought-after voice on criminal justice issues across the entire political spectrum. "What that moment showed me," Crockett reflected in later interviews, "is that people are hungry for substantive discussion about these issues. They're tired of the false choices between being tough on crime or soft on crime. They want solutions that actually work, and they're smart enough to understand complex policies when they're explained clearly and honestly." The success of the exchange also began influencing how media outlets approach discussions of criminal justice and other complex policy issues. Instead of setting up simple debates between opposing viewpoints, producers started seeking out experts who could discuss the nuanced realities of policy implementation. This exchange taught us that our audiences are much smarter than we often assume, explained one television producer. People don't just want to see political figures score points against each other. They want to understand how policies actually work, what the trade-offs are, and how we can build systems that actually solve problems. The conversation sparked by that courtroom exchange continues to influence criminal justice discussions across the country. It provided a model for how political figures can discuss difficult, complex issues without sacrificing either sophistication or accessibility, without abandoning principles or ignoring practical realities. Most importantly, it demonstrated that American political discourse doesn't have to be dominated by sound bites and false choices. When experts with real experience engage in good faith discussions about complex issues, the result can be genuinely enlightening for everyone involved, from the participants to the millions of people watching and learning. The question Judge Mathis asked was designed to be an impossible trap, a way to force Crockett to choose between her reform principles and public safety concerns. But her response transformed it into something much more valuable. A demonstration that the best policy solutions come not from ideological purity or political calculation, but from deep expertise combined with genuine commitment to solving problems that affect real people's lives. The exchange reminded everyone watching that behind every policy debate are actual human beings whose lives hang in the balance. Whether it's a 19-year-old dealer looking for a second chance, a family torn apart by addiction and incarceration, or an innocent victim like Maria Santos whose life was cut short by preventable tragedy, the goal must always be creating systems that protect everyone while offering genuine opportunities for redemption, accountability, and growth. Thanks for watching this incredible exchange that showed what American political discourse could be at its best. If this kind of substantial, expert-driven discussion interests you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss when we break down the moments that really matter in American politics. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Congresswoman Crockett's response and whether it changed how you think about criminal justice reform. The conversation continues, and your voice is essential in shaping how we build a justice system that actually works for everyone.